Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and for my Lightroom video training series, we're going to go over the HDR feature. HDR is high dynamic range, and what that means is that you can capture a series of multiple photos at different exposures, and then Lightroom will blend them together very quickly and easily, giving you much more dynamic range. You'll be able to pull out more shadows and recover more highlights and blown out skies. Anyway, if that doesn't make sense right away, we'll cover it in depth. What you do need to know is set your camera to bracket photos. You could bracket 3, 5, or 7 shots depending on the required dynamic range, then save those raw files into Lightroom. For detailed information about capturing HDR photos, refer to Chapter 11 in Stunning Digital Photography. Right now, I have some photos saved in Lightroom that were captured with this technique, so let's go through the actual processing of them. Here are a few photos that I took in Tokyo, I think. I'll select these 3 photos, right-click one of them, right in the middle there, go to Photo Merge, and then select HDR. This brings up the HDR Merge Preview dialog, and it takes a moment to process. It's going to read in all 3 of the pictures, and then look at the brightest picture, and from the brightest picture, it's going to take the darkest parts of that picture. Really everything that's properly exposed from the brightest picture. But the brightest picture probably has some parts that are overexposed. It's going to fill those in by using one of the pictures taken at the darker exposures. So from each of those 3 pictures, it's going to borrow the parts that are best exposed. Now, one thing you should know about how your camera works is the more light that it gathers in any given part of the picture, the cleaner that part of the picture is going to be. That's why if you peer into the shadow areas of your pictures, you'll see more noise than you do in the highlights, because the highlights gathered more light. The shadows have less light. So I see that our preview is ready, and as you can see, it looks like a very different picture than any of those 3 thumbnails. If you look at this brighter picture here, you see that the sky looks completely white, but the gate is well exposed. And here in the merged picture, the gate is well exposed, but you can see the sky. In this picture, the sky was overexposed, so it took the sky from one of the other pictures that was less exposed, showing the sky. But in these pictures, the gate is a silhouette. So that's the beauty of HDR. You can have a scene with a great deal of dynamic range, a great deal of contrast, like a dark foreground and a bright background like this picture had, and HDR looks at each of the 3 pictures and blends them together really well. You have only a couple of options. The auto align checkbox here is pretty much necessary if you're going to be shooting handheld, but I've never found any problem with leaving it on. If you did take all 3 pictures on a tripod, you could pretty safely turn that off, and maybe it would speed up the processing a little bit. However, I generally just leave it on all the time. Even on a tripod, sometimes the camera can shift a little bit. The auto tone feature will bring down the highlights and shadows and make the picture look more natural. If you were to turn the auto tone off, you'd end up with, well, this is what you see. It wouldn't bother pulling up the shadows as much or bringing down the highlights. So you don't get to see as much of your picture as you would otherwise. Whether or not you turn auto tone on or off, you can change it later. So when you turn on auto tone, it just is basically adjusting the highlights and shadow sliders for you in the develop module. We'll show you that in just a little bit. Your other options are the deghosting amount. By default, it will have none selected, and you can choose to increase the deghosting amount. Ghosting occurs when there is a moving subject between each of your frames. So if you took a picture of somebody that happened to be walking through the frame, or if there were leaves in the frame that happened to be moving, those would appear in one of the 3 frames, but not the others. And as Lightroom blends them together, that could create ghosts to appear, partially translucent subjects. So the deghosting will detect that and remove it. This picture doesn't really have ghosting, but we'll look at some pictures in a moment that do. So we'll leave deghosting off for this picture and then click Merge. Now Lightroom is going to process it. You can click up here to see the current process. So it merged the 3 of them together and saved it as a new DNG file. DNG file, the digital negative file, is an important file type to understand. Now, if you've used other HDR software like Photomatix Pro or even Photoshop, they probably saved it either as a JPEG file or a TIFF file. The DNG file that Lightroom is using is far superior because it's saving all of the raw data from your camera. So basically it's making a single raw file from your 3.5 or 7, from your multiple raw files that has all the original data that your camera captured in the multiple frames. It's pretty amazing that way. So here's the new HDR file, and if you ever want to find that file again, you'll see, we'll look at the file name here. You can see it added -HDR to the end of the file name. So sometimes it'll take a little while to process the HDR, and you might go look at some other picture and not be able to find your HDR file. Open up the text filter here in the grid view, and then type -HDR. And this will filter down the current results to show just the HDR pictures. Make sure you're in the All Photographs catalog to find everything. So as we double click on it here, we can zoom in and we might see a few artifacts. HDR, because it's processing multiple images and because it's kind of drastically changing your highlights and shadows, you can see a little bit of fringing around the edges sometimes. And if we look really closely here, we can see this doesn't look quite natural if you're really picky about it. Up here we see like a little bit of odd color at the edges there. Overall it looks really good. Sometimes these leaves might have moved, and oh look, if you look right here really closely, we can see a little bit of ghosting. So multiple images blended together are never going to be quite as perfect as a single image would be. But overall, I think if you look at this image versus one of the original images, this is the brightest of the original image, and this is the blended image. I think it's pretty clear that the blended image is overall a superior picture because it's showing you that extra sky and really capturing the scene more like my eye saw it. So let's jump into the develop module and see how it is different to edit a picture that's been processed with HDR. Now, I had auto toning turned on when I processed this, and as a result, you can see that it has changed some of these sliders. These would be all reset to 0. It's actually upped the overall exposure a little bit, but then dragged the highlights down. So if we were to reset these, we could see what it looked like without that. And without that, the sky, you can see it's quite overexposed. So backing that up, it recovered the highlights and raised the exposure just to squeeze more into the histogram here, more into the visible histogram, so that the entire picture appears in what are like 9 stops in the histogram. Physically, the scene probably had, let's say, 12 or 15 stops of dynamic range, but it has to cram all of that into like the typical 9 stops that you see. That's why it's recovering the brightest parts and overall raising the exposure. Now, looking at the histogram just aesthetically, you can see there's not really any part that's white or black, and what I'll do to fix that is to drop the blacks a little bit and raise the whites. So this is just a matter of taste, but I almost always like to do this with the Lightroom processed HDR photos. I just want to make sure there's some parts of it that are white and black. Another difference you'll notice is that the exposure slider, looking at the non-HDR picture, as we jump into the develop module here, you'll see that I can drag the exposure slider down -4 all the way to +4. If I switch over to the HDR photo, I can go all the way to -10, all the way to +10. Now in this particular picture, there's not enough dynamic range to go up that high and still see things. But in some pictures, if you were to bracket it over 7 shots or more, you might be able to see that entire plus or -10 range. But it's really nice. See here, you can definitely go past 4 and still see quite a bit of detail left in it. So let's go back to the original settings because those look pretty good. Now you might be thinking, HDR is this brightly saturated kind of annoying art form, and that's not the type of HDR that you get with Lightroom. What you get is something very realistic. Now, the HDR that you're seeing is created by a feature called tone mapping, which looks at individual parts of the picture and adjusts the contrast within the picture itself. Lightroom simply lacks that feature, for better or worse. Therefore, if you are looking for that sort of artistic HDR style, check out an application called Photomatix Pro, as well as Chapter 11 in Stunning Digital Photography. If you do want to try to recreate that artistic feeling in your pictures, there are some things you can do. The first would be to up the clarity here. As you can see, by upping the clarity, that's where it was before and that's where it is after. And this is definitely more HDR-y. Clarity sort of does the same thing. It exaggerates contrast in local areas like the details in the skies here. You might also try upping the vibrance. Finally, you might try playing with the contrast slider. Often you'll have to actually drag the contrast slider down a little bit to simulate traditional HDR. But of course, it's all really to taste. So as we do the before and after here, you can see the after is pretty drastically different. And if you were going for that HDR look, I think we really managed to get it here. The poles really look dynamic and nice and shiny. Let's jump back into the grid view though and look at a more extreme example of bracketing. Here we have this locomotive, which of course locomotives are about as dark as you can possibly get. They're covered in coal soot, and the sun was cresting right above the locomotive, shining right into the camera. So the sun's the brightest thing. And a coal locomotive in shade is about the darkest thing you could possibly get. So I took an awful lot of shots here. Not all of these are from my bracketed exposures, but what does that leave us with? 13 photos. Okay, so I bracketed across 13 photos to capture this. So let's go ahead and merge these into HDR now. Right-click, photo merge, and then HDR. Now this actually could take a bit. Oh, unable to merge the photos. Okay, this does happen sometimes, and unfortunately it doesn't give you a useful error message, but there are a few things you can do. For one, I'm going to try just merging fewer photos. I'm going to go ahead and exclude that photo. And, I'm going to look at the settings here and make sure that none of these have exactly the same settings. Some of these look like they're all at 1/13 of a second. You'd think it could do this for you automatically. 1/6, two of these are at 1/6 of a second, 1/100th. Okay, so these two are at 1/50th of a second. What I've done is make sure there are no duplicate exposures here, and this narrowed it down to just 6 pictures. Let's try this again. Photo merge, HDR. So here's our process picture. As you can see, it's showing the sun isn't completely blowing the sky out. In fact, you can actually see some detail in the sky up here, and we have really good visibility on the train as a whole. In some of these later pictures, you can see that, well, where the sun and the sky look okay, the train disappears in a silhouette, and in these later pictures with the brighter exposures, the train is visible, but the sun itself overwhelms everything and is completely blown out. So here we kind of get the best of both worlds. I shut this on a tripod, but at this point there's no reason not to use the auto align. Sometimes tripods move around a little bit. If I turn off the auto toning, you can see I get a more natural looking picture with better detail in the shadows, with less noise in the shadows. I will go ahead and leave that on, and there were no moving subjects here, so I'll go ahead and leave the deghosting off for this. So let's go ahead and merge these. Watching the progress up here. Now it's saving the HDR. Okay, I wish it would automatically select it for you or something, but checking the file name, this is indeed the picture that we just edited. So let's go into the develop module here. And here I'm going to illustrate the power of being able to drag this up or down by 5 stops. First, let's go ahead and reset the auto toning back to its defaults. So I can raise it up here. You can see here I'm up to like +5 stops, and I'm still able to see detail in the picture. If I drop it way down, I can get to the point, right about. So here I have about -5 stops to +5 stops of detail. well, actually I can still see some pretty good detail even at +8 stops. So it's really nice that you have that extra leeway. If you wanted to do the auto toning yourself, if you missed it, basically what it does is it drops the highlights and then raises the shadows way up. And at that point, you'll just adjust the exposure overall to get a good brightness, and then adjust the whites so that part of your histogram touches the right side and you have some bright whites, and adjust the blacks down so that the histogram here touches. And that's basically what the auto toning is doing. And even if you use the auto toning, you'll probably go in and tweak it a little bit. But as you can see, if we look at this picture versus, say, the previous picture, they're pretty drastically different, and we can just get so much more detail. Let's do a side-by-side comparison. We get so much more detail out of the HDR picture than we could out of any one individual photo. Let's take a look at another HDR scenario which has moving subjects in it, and we'll explore how ghosting works a little bit. Scroll down here into Pariser Platz in Berlin. Here we have 3 bracketed exposures. I'll select them all, right-click, Photo Merge, HDR. Unable to merge the photos. I really wish it gave you some more information. What if we drop the middle exposure? Okay, so troubleshooting the HDR processing, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you why it can't merge the 3 photos. But what I did in both cases was just dropped some of the exposures. Usually with HDR, in the best case, you'll include more photos, as many photos as possible. And most HDR software will just process them all, okay? Lightroom is kind of picky. So you might first drop any duplicate photos. And second, drop photos from the middle of the exposure, keeping the most extreme, brightest and darkest exposures. So this photo is a blending of the brightest and darkest, and it's only 2 photos. You don't need an odd number of photos necessarily. But as you can see, these were long exposures at night, and there were other photographers here and people walking around, and they look like ghosts, sure enough. The deghosting amount here is set to none, but let's set it to high. It's going to process the picture again and then show you a preview of it. And what it's going to try to do is determine which parts of the picture changed between the 2 exposures and then blend them out. Okay, so here it actually made some people reappear. Now if I show the deghost overlay checkbox here it's going to draw red over all the parts of the picture that it applied some sort of deghosting logic to. So this is where it found movement. Basically part of the sky here, and then part of the ground where these people were kind of moving around, as well as some of the sky there. So there's no particular rule for how much deghosting you use. Just go through the different settings and find the setting that you like the most. Now, for me, I like the sort of ghostly movement that you get naturally in long exposures at night. And flipping through each of these 4 settings, I find that I really prefer no deghosting. Now, once you select a deghosting amount and continue with the merge, there's no going back. You can't dial the ghosting up or down from the develop module, nothing like that. However, you can always go back to your original photos, re-merge them, and use the re-merged picture. So let's do a quick before and after using the brightest picture. This is the HDR shot here on the left, and as you can see, because it took the overexposed building here from the less exposed picture, there's much more detail that can be seen. Zooming in here, you can see on the single exposure on the right here, most of the detail in the statue here is lost, whereas most of the detail here is recovered pretty well. And it looks like it did a pretty good job. We really don't see any kind of fringing along the edges. That's the sort of thing I look for. I don't see any particular weird artifacts. I mean, people are coming and going, but most of that is kind of natural. I do want to point out little things like this that you might want to then go in and clone. See those little hot spots here? Little red, black, blue, as well as the street light here. These are just basically HDR flaws. Oh, look at all these red lines here. So here it's tried to recover some different parts of the picture, and it's just, that's a problem that sometimes happen. And sometimes, in fact, having more exposures rather than just 2 pictures will help smooth that out. Didn't let me do that this time. If this becomes too much of a problem, what I'll often do is I'll take the HDR photo and the brightest, one of the exposures, and bring them into layers in Photoshop. So I can do that now. I'll right click it, I'll click export, and then, I'll click edit in, and then open as layers in Photoshop. So Photoshop happened to load the single exposure on top of the HDR exposure. So I'm going to put the HDR exposure on top. I'm just going to drag the layer right up. And now what I'll do is just zoom in and find those kind of problem areas like this here. I'm going to make a mask for this just by clicking the mask icon down here. And the way masks in Photoshop work is the white parts are visible of that layer, and anything that's black in the mask shines through as if you'd cut a hole in the layer. So I'm going to paint parts of this black so that I'll see the original photo underneath. And to do that, I'll just use the brush tool here and have it paint black and make sure I have the layer selected. So now, as I paint in here, you can see I'm painting in the original photo that's actually hidden underneath. And I'm just going to go through, and I'm actually going to make this brush a little bit bigger and a little bit softer. Set the hardness all the way down, just so it looks as natural as it possibly can. So anything unnatural you see, you can often just rectify it by, that didn't look great, by repairing it with the original image. I see a couple weird spots through here. Fix that street light. Oh, look, this guy's head's got something. Okay, well, that's not getting any better. Okay. So with those couple of areas patched, I hit Control W to close it, and then I'll click yes here, and that'll bring it right back into Lightroom. The HDR feature in Lightroom is an extremely practical and useful way to get better image quality out of your existing gear. By bracketing 3, 5, or 7 shots, even more possibly, you can basically eliminate shadow noise in your pictures and allow you to capture detail in the brightest of skies and the darkest of foregrounds. It's not great with moving subjects. Even though it does support deghosting, you'll basically want to be limited to mostly static scenes. If you have any questions, check out Chapter 11 in Stunning Digital Photography, which walks you through the photographic technique and suggests applications that can give you more artistic control over how your HDR photos are processed. Thank you.